Today's passage is from the book of Ezra, chapter 4, verses 1 through 24. Ezra 4, 1 through 24. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because, like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Eshach, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jehuah, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building the temple of our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." Then the people around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They hired counselors to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Belshazzar, Medareth, Tabeel, and the rest of his associates wrote a letter to Artaxerxes. The letter was written in Arabic script and in the Aramaic language. Rehum, the commanding officer of Shimei, the secretary, wrote the letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes, the king, as follows. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, together with the rest of the associates, the judges and the officials over the men of Tripolis, Persia, Erech and Babylon, and the Emilites of Susa, and the other people whom the great and honorable Ashiphael deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere to the Trans-Euphrates. This is a copy of the letter they sent him to King Artaxerxes. From your servants, the men of Trans-Euphrates, the king should know that the Jews who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding the rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundation. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid, and the royal revenues will suffer. Now, since we are under obligation to the palace, and it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, we are sending this message to inform the king, so that the search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In these records, you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to the kings and provinces, a place of rebellion from ancient times. This is why the city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates. The king sent a reply to Rehum, the commanding officer, Shimshai, the secretary, and the rest of the associates living in Samaria and elsewhere in the Trans-Euphrates. Greetings. The letter you sent us has been read and translated in my presence. I issued an order and a search was made, and it was found that the city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole Trans-Euphrates, and taxes, tribute, and duty were paid to them. Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that this city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interests? As soon as the copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary, and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. I want to begin today with another edition of Brian's Bag of Jokes. Just one for you today. A man wanted to buy a boat, and he was really interested in this and wanted to go sailing, but his wife thought it was just a colossal waste of money. And the two argued about it for months. Finally, the man felt his wife was just starting to wear down, and he said, "Okay, how about a compromise? If you let me buy the boat, I'll let you name it. His wife agreed. The man purchased his boat, and he went to the marina for the maiden voyage, and he saw in big red letters on the side of the boat its new name. The boat's name was For Sale. Today we return to the book of Ezra. Today we're going to talk about compromise. Now we are jumping over a couple chapters in Ezra because not a lot happens in those chapters. Chapter 2 is a list of genealogies of the people who returned to Israel, reminding us that the people who came back from exile really were the descendants of those who first went into exile. And chapter 3 tells of the first sacrifice that was made. The temple foundation had been completed, and the people want to immediately make a sacrifice. And that brings us to chapter 4. And now, things are going to get interesting. The Israelites had been working on the temple of the Lord to build it up. And we're told that the enemies of Benjamin and Judah came and offered to help build the temple. Now, Ezra calls these people who offered to help build the enemies of Benjamin and Judah, but I think that he says that with the advantage of hindsight. At the time, I don't think it was quite as black and white. Ezra identified himself and his people as the people of Benjamin and Judah, two of the original 12 tribes of Judah. However, this was probably because of where they were living, as they were living in the territory once occupied by Benjamin and Judah. But we know from chapter 2 that there were people from several different tribes who had come back to Israel. Here's the thing. These enemies, these people who offered to help build the temple, were also descended from the Israelites. They were descendants of Abraham. It was just a little more complicated. Before Nebuchadnezzar came and conquered Jerusalem, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been conquered by the Assyrians. And the people in the northern kingdom had been sent into exile. However, for the past couple hundred years, they had slowly been making their way back to their homeland. And these people were Israelites, but while they were in exile, they had intermarried with the nations around them. And when they returned to Israel, they continued to intermarry with the surrounding nations. And they started to combine the worship of the Lord with the worship of these various other gods. And what they ended up with was a very strange religion, in which they called on the name of the Lord, but they also chased after other gods. And they would kind of pick and choose which parts of God's commands they would keep. These people eventually became the Samaritans, and they continued to have a contentious relationship with the Jews on through to the days of Jesus. And these people came offering to help build the temple. And when that offer came, I think that would have been a very tempting offer. I mean, they're still Israelites, even if the family tree is kind of hard to follow. They still serve the Lord, even if they didn't obey him in every way. More than that, they had money. They had cash. They had manpower to do the work. The Israelites who had come to build the temple were not nearly numerous enough to complete this work. Even with the funds that King Cyrus had set aside to build this temple, the people who were doing the work were wildly understaffed and underfunded. There would have been a real temptation to invite these Samaritans, these enemies of Benjamin and Judah, to come and help to do the work. There were probably 10 times as many Samaritans as there were Israelites ready to do this work. I think there would have been part of them saying, well, we'll still be in charge. And yeah, they worship the Lord, even if they don't have everything right. So what's the harm? No. Luckily, the people did recognize the harm. That if they had allowed these Samaritans to be part of building the temple itself, if they had allowed these people who chased after other gods to be foundational in the worship of the Lord, they would have compromised their faith. And this would eventually have led the people to join with the Samaritans. And this large group of Samaritans would have enveloped the Israelites. They would have done basically what the Samaritans had already done. They would have intermingled with those who did not worship the Lord. And they would have corrupted their own worship through compromise. I think still today we face a temptation to compromise. Now, first I want to say that compromise isn't always bad. We need to know when to compromise. A person who will never compromise on anything will never accomplish anything. And he'll probably drive all his friends away while accomplishing nothing. So we need to know when to compromise. But we also need to know when not to compromise. Compromise has been called the success of marriage, the genius of politics, and the death of conviction. There's a lot of ways we do compromise. We compromise our style. We compromise our way of doing things. We compromise what we want. Never compromise conviction. So if we compromise conviction, we'll never accomplish anything that lasts. If we compromise conviction, it tears everything else down. Let me tell you a story. As far as I just kind of want to tell you this story, but I think it fits here. This week, James and I had an adventure. We went to Millrace Park. That's the place where we normally start our bike ride each year for the church, which, by the way, we are going to do this fall, God willing. Anyway, if you've ever been to Millrace Park, you know that they have this tall observation tower, about 6 stories tall. And James saw that tower, immediately he wanted to climb it. So we did. We walked up 6 stories worth of stairs. We got to the top, we looked around, looked out over the river, and then we walked back down. And on the second to the last set of stairs from the bottom, James tripped. And he scraped up his knee really bad. And he bled, but he cried for about 15 seconds, and then he was fine and wanted to go play again. So he's okay. All right, that's my version of the story. If you can get James to tell you his version of the story, it is a much, much better story. Here's how James told this story when we got home that night. Higher, higher, boom, boo, boo. That's a great story. That's also a really good description of compromise in our lives. Compromise starts out feeling really good. If we're willing to compromise our convictions, suddenly we start to feel like we're getting everything done. We feel like we're going higher and higher, and then boom, boo-boo. Compromise in conviction doesn't make anything that lasts. Eventually, it always comes crashing down on top of us. We need to know when to compromise, that we can compromise our style, our desires, our way of doing things, but never compromise conviction. Never compromise what you know is true and right. Because there's always going to be a call to compromise. Sometimes the call to compromise is directly sin. Probably the most common excuse for compromising with what we know is sin is that everybody else does it. You know, everybody else cheats. Everybody else tells white lies. Everybody else fibs to make themselves look better. Why do I have to be the one who is honest? And the devil tries to get us to compromise with what we know is wrong because everybody else does it. Sometimes compromise is not so blatant. Often sin does not come at us with bells and whistles and a warning signal. The devil does not approach us and say, "Hi, I'm Lucifer. I'm here to tempt you into eternal damnation if you'll just sign on the bottom line." Usually sin does not come with a warning siren. Compromise instead comes as a way to have a good time, even if we know we're putting ourselves in a dangerous situation. Compromise comes as a way to let off a little bit of steam, even if we know that there are more godly ways to let off steam. Compromise comes as a way to get things done faster, even if we know that it comes with a cost. And sometimes we'll try to make excuses. We'll say, "I'm not doing anything that's really wrong yet." but we know we're setting ourselves down a bad road. And it's been said that the surest way to hell is the gradual one. The one with no sharp turns, no steep inclines, with no warning signs. The devil tries to get us to compromise what we know is right. Now, in this case, the Israelites recognized the threat. They recognized they could not compromise with those who chased after false gods. And so they turned these enemies of Benjamin and Judah away. And then these enemies, these Samaritans, showed their true colors. If compromise wouldn't work, they would try intimidation. They used force and threat to try to get the Israelites to stop work on the temple. Apparently their philosophy was, if we don't get to build the temple, nobody should. Now, there was not a lot the Samaritans to do during the reign of Cyrus. There have been many kings throughout history who were easy to manipulate. Cyrus was not on that list. Cyrus had given a command that the temple should be rebuilt, and going against Cyrus was bad for your health. So while Cyrus was alive, there was a limit to what the Samaritans could do. They tried indirect techniques. They hired counselors to frustrate the work. They tried to intimidate the Israelites so they would be afraid and stop doing the work. They never did anything so bad that someone could lodge a complaint with King Cyrus, but they did what they could to slow the work. Now, Cyrus died, and then Xerxes became king. You might remember the name Xerxes from the book of Esther. Xerxes was the king that Esther eventually married and helped to save the Jewish people who were in Persia. And the Samaritans lodged a complaint with Xerxes. However, perhaps because of his marriage to Esther, Xerxes knew enough about the Israelites to dismiss his complaint out of hand. After Xerxes died, then Artaxerxes became the new king. And Artaxerxes was a little less knowledgeable, a little more open to propaganda. And again, the Samaritans lodged a complaint. They said that the Israelites were rebuilding Jerusalem. If the king checks his records, he'd find out that Jerusalem was not a city he wanted rebuilt. These people were rebellious. They had a habit of going against the kings, and they were pretty good at it, which is true. At the height of its power, a small force of soldiers could hold Jerusalem against a vast army for years. And when Artaxerxes checked into this, and he found this history of rebellion, he decided to put a stop to the work on the temple. Now, Ezra jumps back and forth a little bit in time here. He seems less concerned with chronology and more concerned with describing this persecution the Israelites faced. But he says that work stopped until the second year of King Darius, about a decade later. And I think still today we face something like this. That if the devil can't get us to compromise by tempting us, he'll try to threaten us into compromise. He'll try to make us afraid. And this comes in a lot of different ways. That when we face a temptation and we won't compromise easily, then the world uses threats of force. It tries to scare us. I think this really leads to one question for me, and that is, who do we fear? The book of Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Do we fear the Lord, or do we fear this world? A fear of this world looks like social intimidation. And if you invite somebody to church, then people are just going to think you're a religious nut. Or if you don't join in and do what everybody else does, then you're always going to feel like an outsider. Fear of this Lord is financial intimidation. You can't afford to be as giving as God wants you to be. Or if you don't bend the rules at least a little bit, you're never going to get ahead at work. The fear of the Lord is status intimidation. If we don't buy into the commercialism of this world, what are the neighbors going to think? Or how can I chase after God, but still go after all these distractions that surround me? That's the fear of this world. But the fear of the Lord drives out the fear of this world. And Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew, don't be afraid of someone who can kill the body and can't harm the soul. Fear the one who can kill the body and then throw your soul into hell. When we fear the Lord, it drives out the fear of this world. I have one more thing to say about fear. I'm going to use this to kind of close up today's sermon. This will be my last thought today. I talked about the fear of the Lord and the fear of the world. And in both cases I use the word fear, but I don't want you to think they are the same thing. Because these are a different kind of fear. The world wants us to be terrified. The world wants us to know that it can take away all comfort, that it can hurt those that we care about or hurt us, or in the most extreme circumstance, even kill us. That is terror. That is the fear of this world. The fear of the Lord is something different. God does not want us to be terrified. Yes, we fear God because to not fear the power of the Almighty is madness. But it's a different kind of fear. We are not terrified of God. We are not afraid. Because as John wrote in 1 John, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Jesus did not come into this world to scare us. He came into this world because he loves us. He came to die for us, to rise from the dead, to bring us to life. He came to set us free. He did not set us free from fear so that we could then be enslaved to a different kind of fear. He set us free from fear so that we could live as slaves to righteousness. He set us free from sin so that the fear and the compromise of this world would never have a hold on us again. He came to free us from fear. Because this world can bark all that it wants. But if God is on our side, who can stand against us? In a moment, we're going to stand for our invitation hymn. And as we stand to sing, if you need to make your own commitment to the Lord, if fear or compromise have been dogging your life and you desire the freedom of Jesus Christ, if you need to make your first commitment to him, if you need to make a new commitment to him, you have that opportunity. I ask you'll stand with me for an invitation hymn, which is Glory to his name, for 527, and we'll sing all the verses.